From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, checking in from London town. Recently, I've been doing some work on vaccinations, looking at the reasons why someone might opt to avoid having themselves or their child vaccinated. This can be something as simple as not having the freedom to take time out of precarious minimum wage work, or any other so-called barrier to access that calls into question whether the UK health service is truly universal. Something that came up less often in my research was the role of misinformation. In fact, many sources explicitly state that barriers to access are almost entirely responsible for the fact that the UK is failing to reach WHO coverage targets. That seems strange to me, and also didn't match what we know historically from cases like Andrew Wakefield in the 1990s. For those who don't know, Wakefield published a now retracted paper in The Lancet, falsely claiming a link between autism and the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. And at least some of the contemporary scepticism towards that vaccine, and others, can be traced back to that original controversy over 20 years ago. In other words, vaccine misinformation has had an impact on vaccination rates, as well as trust in public health initiatives. All of that to say, I'm not willing to buy that misinformation doesn't affect behaviour, particularly when historical examples suggest otherwise. During my research, one organisation that was willing to talk about the role of misinformation was the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. The centre focuses on identity-based hate, misinformation, extremism, fake news, trolling, and how these things can polarise societies and undermine democracy. Today, I'm pleased to welcome the centre's founder and CEO, Imran Ahmed. In this episode, we talk about some of the centre's successes, the power of deplatforming, and the social media platforms as a public square. We also talk about the role of big tech platforms in content moderation, erosion of our trust in institutions, and the need for us all to take responsibility with the content we choose to share. One part of the conversation may need some context. We talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which 600 African American men were studied to understand what happens when syphilis is left untreated. The men were falsely told that they would receive free healthcare, but never did. Instead, many of them died and passed syphilis on to their wives, and by extension, in some cases, their newborn children. The study has left a stain on the US public health service and a legacy of mistrust, leading to a presidential apology and changes to the law requiring that studies now have informed consent from participants. Graphic imagery from the study is currently being used by some misinformation groups to undermine modern vaccination efforts, which illustrates the complexity of what we're dealing with when it comes to re-establishing trust in institutions. In other words, people are right to be mistrustful when institutions have created mistrust. And what's true of public health is also true of politics. The sea of misinformation has ramifications not just for vaccination initiatives, but also how people choose to cast their vote at the polls. I'm not convinced that deplatforming bad actors is the best solution, especially in the long term. Will I really miss conspiracy nuts? Probably not. But my disagreement with the tactic is in the potential it has to be applied to speakers we simply find distasteful, or disagree with, rather than somebody shouting bomb in a crowded theatre. Did people follow the deplatformed conspiracy nuts to new platforms? No. But should tech platforms be the arbiters of what's deemed acceptable online discourse? Absolutely not. Regardless, I'm glad that people like Imran are at least exploring ways of fighting back in the information war. We need to be able to make sense of the world, particularly when we're now spending so much time stuck behind screens, separated from our social circles. It's a great conversation, and I hope that, at the least, it encourages you to consider what you share and how you engage online. Imran, it's really good to speak with you today. Could you tell us a bit about why you decided to set up the centre?
So the Centre for Countering Digital Hate was set up to look at the use of identity-based hate within our political system to bring forward fringe political movements that really hadn't been seen for a long time in Western democracies. And it was the particular harnessing of digital hate actors, so people that were able to go and harass the enemies of liberal democracy, able to promote new abstruse political ideologies, and also to reshape the way that we understood the world. And what do I mean by that? It means misinformation about, for example, the number of migrants, or the impact of migration, or how certain communities in the UK or the US behave. And we knew that misinformation, which quite often was delivered through social media platforms, through spaces that were otherwise innocuous, that we knew that we had to disrupt, because what it was doing is fundamentally undermining not just our basic liberal, democratic, tolerant politics, but also it was reshaping our understanding of the world around us and creating these fissures in our society, in the corpus of knowledge that we accept to be fact. And in doing so was undermining our common realities, the common realities that underpin the scientific method, that underpin a lot of the progress that we're able to make as societies. And of course, that misinformation and that architecture is exactly the same as is being used to proselytize climate change denial, vaccine misinformation, coronavirus misinformation, and misogyny and other forms of racial and religious intolerance. So that's why we were set up. When coronavirus came along, it was a no-brainer for us to shift our approach and our tactics, which in terms of both analysis and disruption were perfectly suited for dealing with coronavirus misinformation and vaccine misinformation, because it was the same architectural components comprising the systems that were spreading anti-vax beliefs as there were spreading identity-based hate. And quite often the same actors as well. I mean, take David Icke, for example, who is an anti-Semite, an Islamophobe, an anti-migration campaigner, someone who currently is campaigning against Black Lives Matter, saying that they don't. And at the same time was one of the worst proselytizers of coronavirus misinformation and anti-vax misinformation.
And that was one of your huge successes, and where I wanted to begin as well. Could you talk a bit about the David Icke campaign and the strategies that you used in that approach and why it is so effective?
I mean, one of the things that we do as an organisation is think very hard about how to ensure that consequences can be paid for malignant behaviour. So in offline society, if you were to call me a racial swear word, or if I was to use a gendered insult or a homophobic insult, there would be consequences. I mean, I'd lose my career over it. You would see a loss of stature and position as well. And society regulates our behaviour through consequences. In online spaces, for too long, there has been impunity for the worst kinds of malignant behaviour. So whether it's identity-based hate or it's misinformation spread, and worse still, the underlying logic of those platforms algorithmically privileges misinformation and hate. Now, what do I mean by that? Two things. First of all, that those actors are given access to a reach that they've never had before, billions of people, whereas before they'd have to skulk around in the shadows, as well they should. But second, that in fact misinformation is prioritised, is given a greater prominence on those platforms than good information. And why is that true? Because those platforms are based on one immutable logic. They want to keep your attention for as long as possible so they can serve you advertising. 98% of all of Facebook's revenues, this multi-billion pound company, is from advertising. And so they need to keep you on the platform. They operate in the attention economy, and what gets your attention? It ain't facts. You know, and even quite often it's our own behaviour. So we'll answer back to, a nasty hate actor, or we'll quote tweet them and say, look at this, it's disgusting. But in doing so, we signal to the algorithm, you know what, this is important, this is engaging content. And so when you go on Twitter, when you go on Facebook, you don't see a timeline, you don't literally see every post in order. What you see is an algorithmically generated, an artificially generated list of content prioritized by that which is most likely to keep you scrolling down. And in doing so, misinformation is prioritized, which is why we seem to see more of it. Is there actually more of it? I don't know. But do we see more of it? Absolutely. And that has a normalization effect. And that's the cultural effect that it has. That it starts to make formerly abstruse fringe beliefs seem normal. And the problem that has is that then has a knock-on effect in making them more acceptable, more popular, and therefore causing even more of a problem. And that's the situation we find ourselves in. So how do you disrupt that? Well, we create those consequences, whether economic, reputational, economic consequences, for example, by showing advertisers their brands appearing next to malignant content on fake news websites set up to spread misinformation, or by going to Facebook and saying, we don't say your algorithm's bad, we just say, are you really sure that you're happy having this on your website? And then we show them. And quite often their reaction, because they don't want to be they don't want people to know what they actually do tolerate on their systems, is to act very fast to deplatform. And that's really been our tactics, has been to use examples to set the precedents by which we can engender cultural change, such that these companies actually start enforcing their own terms of service, something they have singularly failed to do to date.
I know that critics have said that in a world where these platforms are acting as a de facto public square, is it right to just remove someone from the conversation entirely? What would you say to critics who think that this could just push things further underground?
Well, a public square is a free and open platform, and as we've described at CCDH, these are not fair and open platforms. These platforms algorithmically privilege the formerly fringe, the misinformation out there. I mean, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. right now. If I looked out of my window and I said to you, you know what, the sky's green, you'd say, what? What's going on? Is there something wrong there? Is there a chemical leak? Have you got tinted windows? If I said to you the sky was blue, you just shrug. And misinformation is more engaging. We just tend to sort of, as a species, we actually are quite conformist. So we have a corpus of knowledge and we seek to force people to conform with it. And in that respect, when we see people espousing aberrant views, and the more bananas, the better. So if someone says we're run by a race of lizards from the planet Archon, then people go, no, let's engage with this. This is clearly bananas. It's dangerous. And in doing so on digital platforms, what we do is we algorithmically privilege that information. Does everyone that follows Icke and that sort of buys into the anti-vax stuff or the coronavirus misinformation believe that there are lizards from the planet Archon? No. And that, again, is one of the problems, that often the reporting focuses on that which is sensational. And it can make him give plausible deniability to the idea that, no one really believes that lizards... Yes, but lots of people do believe that coronavirus isn't caused by a virus. They believe that it's caused by 5G. But the fact that he has the reach in the first place allows him to do so. And the reach is given in part by the fact that some of his views are so, bonkers, really. So the question then becomes, well, how do you deal with that? Now, look, we've had to deal with malignant actors online before, and the social media companies have shown a complete willingness to do so, if they're, for example, Islamist terrorists. And actually, the best studies of what was most effective in disrupting the networks, and the same tactics, but just in a different field, being used by Al-Shabaab, for example, is J.M. Berger, who's a counter-violent extremism and counter-terrorism specialist. And he found that deplatforming was the single thing that worked when it came to those organisations. So we've studied ourselves as to what happened to Icke, for example, after his deplatforming. His reach went down from 2 or 3 million to a few 100,000. And so people say they'll follow him to the next platform. They didn't. And you want to know why? It's because he was being algorithmically privileged and amplified by Facebook and Twitter, which gave him this unprecedented reach. A. B. That actually the number of views that he got per video went down from 150,000 to around 6,000. And why is that? Because not that many people are actually interested in what this boring man has to say. And he is a very boring man. But actually, when it comes up on your autoplay feature, more people get to see it. And that's the other problem, is that the recommendation engines still recommend nonsense. And we know that even though they claim to have fixed that, that is absolutely untrue. I am still getting recommendations on the accounts that we use for tracking misinformation for misinformation actors.
So what do you do about that when it's baked into the way in which the tech companies operate, and there are financial incentives to serve up a diet of misinformation. And I guess as a second question to that, what do you do about regulating the tech companies when they operate internationally across geographical boundaries and borders?
Look, social media can be incredibly powerfully good, and COVID has kind of shown us the best and the worst, right? So how have we connected with the people that we love, that we care about, that we miss? How have we found entertainment and succor in these very, very isolating and dark moments? Social media has been incredibly powerful for bringing people together, for making this a more tolerable situation than it would otherwise have been. But at the same time, it's been the vector through which so much misinformation is being spread. And when you come to industries that have a huge social good, but also have really serious negative consequences, think of the big banks, think of big oil, think of other industries. Well, we've regulated them. That is the means by which we remove the profit incentive from allowing these consequences to be dealt with impunity. And so the simple answer is, well, you regulate. And the question of how you do so on an international level, well, of course, it would be ideal if we could come to some sort of international consensus on that. We're not going to get it straight away, so let's do it. There's two ways in which you create international law. There's statute, but there's also jus cogent. So there's commonly recognised standards which achieve the effect of having international legal binding status. And we're saying, well, let's just get lots and lots of people to agree. So let's get lots of countries to agree. And we're starting with home, first of all, which is because we're British. So the online harms bill, and we're lobbying around that. And I am on the pilot task force steering committee for the Commission for Countering Extremism, which is a Home Office body. And I'm making my representations through that body too, and making our arguments as to why hate and misinformation should be cleaned up from those platforms. They should be held to the terms of service that they themselves have. Because, of course, we're not asking for anything more than they claim to be doing anyway, which is to stop coronavirus misinformation, anti-vax misinformation, and the spread of identity-based hate. We're merely asking that there is a backstop to that we have some way of ensuring that it occurs. And the online harms bill is a powerful way of doing it, but we know there are lots of other legislatures around the world which are looking, because coronavirus has crystallised that the threat is not just to Muslims. And, most of us aren't Muslim. Despite my name, I'm personally not Muslim myself. My family are. So I don't feel that personal threat myself. But not all of us are Jewish. Not all of us are black. Not all of us are gay. However, coronavirus can affect any of us and kill any of us. And really, that's what's brought it home so clearly to so many people. We need to deal with this problem now. And I think the strategic mistake that these companies have made was trying to get away with what they've done in the past, which is saying, oh, of course we'll fix this thing, and then doing nothing about it. In fact, Facebook got rid of most of its content moderators during COVID. At the same time as Mark Zuckerberg became one of the world's newest centibillionaires, worth $100 billion US, and at the same time as they invested $400 million into Jiffy, which is a nice way to insert cat memes into your Facebook post. But they couldn't spend that $400 million on content moderation to avert a pandemic of misinformation, which has accompanied this biological pandemic of coronavirus and made it worse.
One of the challenges is, I was looking through some of your reports and I came across one particular image that stuck out, an image of the syphilis study, and that was being weaponized by an anti-vax group with specific reference to a COVID-19 vaccine, using historical injustices and tragedies to peddle a contemporary agenda of misinformation. What do we do to rebuild and re-establish confidence and trust in institutions?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to take away the problem first before we can start talking about healing the body politic. And so, we have a disease right now, and that disease is misinformation, and we're going to need to deal with that first. So let's deal with the pathogen. At the same time, what we need to be doing is understanding what it is that's happening to us and making sure that we don't worsen it through our own activities. And then we need to start thinking about rebuilding so that we're stronger in future. And there's a lot of things that we're going to have to do to rebuild trust in authorities. Now, I don't think that trust in scientific authorities is low. In fact, the polling that we did in the US, for example, looking at Tuskegee, we did polling of African Americans and found that their trust in scientists was exactly the same as white audiences. It was very high. Their trust in government is low, but so it was also true about white audiences as well. The question is, have we who proselytize scientific truths and facts, have we done enough to speak to those audiences? And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. If the bad guys are going and thinking to themselves, you know what, we can weaponize historic injustices to damage the relationship between the truth and those communities, well, actually there is a duty upon us to make sure in future that we do not allow that to happen by inoculating against misinformation, by ensuring people have the facts. And that is something that is a whole of society thing. It's not just on the scientific community, it's also about education, it's also about legislators, it's a whole bunch of us that have to work together to make this be more effective.
And one of the things I noticed as well is you have emphasis on users, so don't feed the trolls and don't spread the virus. Also bringing the users of the platforms in and exercising their own personal responsibility when it comes to the sorts of information that they're propagating and sharing within their own communities.
Well, I'm very cautious not to blame users for the problems created by the social media platforms and bad actors. But you're right, we can all play a part as well. And one of the things that we teach people is that the rules of physics of these new environments are different. One of the examples I give is that light bends in social media platforms. So in real life, if I'm standing in front of you with a placard and you're holding a placard, people can see both. Online, if I'm the NHS and I'm saying, coronavirus is a threat, and there's someone shouting from the sidelines with 50 followers saying coronavirus isn't a threat, no one can see them. But if I make the critical mistake of thinking I have to engage with them, of pulling them into my world, then we're both visible. So actually, quote tweeting engagement is a bad thing to do. We've suggested people take away that temptation. And we know that that malignant actors know that this technique works. So they know the harder they hit you, the more bananas the misinformation, the more painful, hurtful the insult. And when it comes to identity-based hate, we've seen them literally go through the lists of swear words and insults and go, this one's the one that really, really gets to them. That actually they're trying to induce a reaction. What's the best way to stop yourself reacting to something? Remove the temptation in the first instance. Remove the irritant. Block them. Just block them. The worst thing that you could possibly do to one of those folks is to not see what they have to say, because they want to preach their creed.
I'd like to finish just by asking you a couple of questions about what you're up to at the moment. So how are things going with Stop Funding Fake News?
And Stop Funding Fake News is one of our programs which was designed to... So quite often when people are in Facebook groups on Twitter, they won't say, I think X. They'll say, look at this article which says X. And those articles are from websites which are designed to spread misinformation. They're designed to be used for that purpose. And they fund themselves by having Google ads on there. And it's disgusting that Google, first of all, monetizes misinformation sites and hate sites, but they do. And when they do that, what we do is we show advertisers their adverts appearing on those sites, and we ask them to remove their ads, and they do, almost in every single instance. And we found that simple act of using our activists to go out and persuade people to remove their ads can demonetize a site, to the point where in the last few months, for example, we targeted Voice of Europe, one of the worst far-right websites in Europe. It took us 10 weeks of targeting for them to have to put up a page saying farewell. Their advertising revenue had dipped below the levels at which they could sustain themselves, and they had to shut down. So it is a tool in the arsenal that we have of creating consequences for malignant behaviour. And for, these are about rectifying information asymmetry. So the information asymmetry there is that eBay doesn't know where its ads are appearing because Google's not telling them, and it's putting them on a misinformation site. So by doing so, by serving both eBay and society, we can remove the funding for malignant actors. It's a fantastically simple program. But we seek to expand that because there are other types of malignant information out there, whether it's climate change denial, it's misogyny, it's other types of identity-based hate. We will deal with them. And we're about to open a program looking at specifically misogynistic and the kind of misinformation that seeks to undermine sexual and reproductive rights of women. That is something that we want to ensure that we're combating, because it is part of the radical worldview, that this counter-enlightenment that we see in digital spaces that needs to be dealt with, because it is fundamentally starting to undermine the sentiments that underpin the values that make liberal democracy possible. And my great fear is that we can survive anything, liberal democracies. We can survive pandemics, we can survive natural disasters, but we cannot survive the loss of the liberal nature of our democracies. Once we start to become illiberal democracies, they start to become vociferous, they start to break apart, and we go down routes which lead to devastation. We cannot allow that to happen without there being some sort of counterforce. And my message to those who seek to use those environments to spread their counter-enlightenment creed, are you surprised that we're fighting back? Did you really think it would take us forever to work out what you were up to? And welcome to the fight back.
Imran, that's a really wonderful place to wrap up, and I wish you all the best with everything that you're doing. Before I do let you go, we usually wrap up with a quick fire round.
Sure.
Which emerging field or technology are you most excited about?
See, this is the thing. You're going to ask me this question. It's going to reveal what I really am inside. The PlayStation 5, because that's what I'm most excited about. But what field? I am actually, because I started at med school and I went and studied politics some years later, and so I'm always curious and always hungry to learn and read. At the moment, I'm reading Robert Sapolsky's book Behave on neurology, and thinking a lot about the insular cortex, the co-location of our disgust sensitivity and our in-out group thinking. So, which is why the pandemic is driving xenophobia and right-wing authoritarianism. So that's something I'm really interested in, is bringing in neurology and into sort of behavioural science and the work that we do in hate and misinformation.
To that point, have you seen Dave Pizarro at Cornell University's stuff on disgust sensitivity? I think that might be worth checking out if you haven't. He's done some really good research on that.
I'd love to. One of my favorite, there is an experiment about piping the smell of flatulence into a room and seeing how people vote, and they vote more right wing, which I love.
That was actually going to be one of the next questions, is what's your best or worst digital hate related joke or fact, but I guess we can skip that one. If you could wave a magic wand and shift our collective thinking on one thing, what would it be?
I think it would be to start to understand that there is a very simple answer to the question of how we fix social media, which is that it's the same tools that we use to socialise the offline world, and that there's no need to look at the digital world as being something fundamentally different. It's not. It's just a realm through which it's intermediated by human beings, just as the real world is. And that all we need to do is be a little bit more, we need to treat online spaces as we do offline spaces. If someone behaves in a bad way, don't talk to them, because they're clearly, not worth talking to. And I treat my social media feed as I do my offline feed. If you are rude to me in real life, I'll never talk to you again. I mean, I don't want to waste my life talking to people who are mean or rude or horrid. I mean, I actually seek out, as we all do, people who are nice to us, who are kind and good-hearted. And why on earth would we expose ourselves to it online? So, block people. And if people that are close to you are behaving in a malignant way, tell them it's unacceptable. And very quickly we'd find that the online world was much, much less of a horrid space to be in, and much more like our offline world, which frankly most of the time is just, it's okay.
Well, thank you so much for the time. Again, I just want to wish you all the best with everything that you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. It's lovely talking to you.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.